Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back in AI era Islamic Abrahamic wisdom. Today we stand at the most dangerous moment in the life of any state, the moment after power, but before certainty. History teaches us a hard truth. States rarely collapse on the battlefield. They collapse when leadership becomes vacant. In 23 Hijri, as Hazrat Umar ibn al-Khattab, radiyallahu anhu, lay fatally wounded, he faced a challenge greater than war or famine. How can power be transferred without bloodshed, coercion, or dynasty? From the landmark scholarly work, The Foundation of Islamic Jurisprudence, Volume 1, Subvolume 3, by Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir, today's episode examines Case 18, how Umar, radiallahu
Welcome
an,
back to the
turned
deep dive.
personal
When
mortality
we
into
study the great
constitutional
movements of
foresight
history, the rise
and
and fall
saved the
of
Ummah
empires,
from
we
chaos
often
before it began.
romanticize the dramatic moments.
Oh, absolutely. The military campaigns, the diplomatic breakthroughs, the moments of, peak expansion.
Exactly. But our sources today, which are drawn from some really extensive research into early Islamic governance, particularly from Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir's work on jurisprudence, they confirm a brutal, counterintuitive fact. A fact that really defines the destiny of nations.
It's the flip side of the coin, isn't
Oh,
it? The
yeah.
core finding from this research is just absolutely stark and I think universally applicable. Most states do not collapse during war. They collapse during succession.
That is it right there. War tests the walls and the armies, for sure. But transition, that specific moment of succession, it tests the constitutional foundation. And if the rules governing that handoff are unclear, if the moment that supreme authority becomes vacant is defined by, well, ambiguity, that is the ultimate invitation to chaos.
There's no middle ground.
None. You either have a predictable constitutional mechanism to fill that power vacuum, or you have bloodshed. It's almost always one or the other.
And that is the high-stakes moment we are diving into today. We are looking at one of the most critical constitutional challenges in the entire history of the nascent Islamic State. We're talking about the impending death of the second caliph, Hazrat Umar ibn al-Khattab. May God be pleased with him.
Right. This is in the year 23 AH, which for our listeners corresponds to 61644 CE.
And he had been fatally wounded. He knew his life was ending. And in that moment, he faced a truly monumental question. How do you ensure that the leadership transition happens not just peacefully, but also without coercion?
Without the military imposing a leader.
Exactly. And maybe most importantly, without kicking off a destructive dynastic struggle that could unravel everything they had spent decades building.
It is the ultimate high-stakes political situation. I mean, the political stability, maybe the very survival of this entire rapidly expanding state, it all rested on one man's final decision.
A decision he has to make while staring mortality directly in the face.
Which is why our mission today is to unpack how Umar, may God be pleased with him, took that personal crisis, that moment of vulnerability, and transformed it into what our source material emphatically calls constitutional foresight.
That's the perfect term for it.
Okay, so let's unpack this. This is a monumental moment. Umar didn't just, worry about the general idea of succession. He seems to have formalized the specific political dangers that come from a power vacuum.
He did. He essentially provided a 5-point and terrifyingly accurate forecast of systemic disaster if he failed to act decisively and, well, constitutionally.
And he understood something key, didn't he? That leaving the mechanism unspoken, leaving the choice vague, that wasn't a philosophical position of neutrality or wisdom.
No, not at all. It was fundamentally a position of negligence.
Negligence.
That phrase, which the source material we're drawing from really defines as foundational, silence about succession is not neutrality, it is negligence. That's the constitutional concept you have to internalize to understand all of this.
Oh, it makes perfect sense.
Because when there is a vacuum at the pinnacle of power, human nature, political ambition, tribal loyalties, raw self-interest, they all rush in to fill it.
And they don't do it peacefully.
Almost never. Historically, they rarely do so peacefully or constructively, and we see these 5 disasters recur throughout history across every single civilization whenever the succession rules fail or are just ignored.
So walk us through those disasters in detail because they sound terrifyingly familiar, even in the political crises we read about today. What exactly did he anticipate if he just did nothing.
Certainly. The first and most immediate risk is factional violence.
Okay.
This is the instantaneous breakdown of political dispute into physical confrontation. It's what happens when talk stops and fighting starts.
Because there's no agreed-upon process.
Exactly. If the rules are unclear, then every competing group, be it a tribe, a political alliance, a powerful regional governor, they can all plausibly claim the right to leadership. And when that happens, they stop lobbying and they start fighting. The political disagreement immediately turns into a physical confrontation, and the fight itself becomes the decision mechanism.
Which is invariably bloody.
Invariable.
And we know from history that once that kind of violence starts, it legitimizes the use of force, which then leads directly to the second danger you mentioned.
Precisely. The second inevitable disaster is military intervention.
The army steps in.
Always. If the civilian structure fails to produce a legitimate leader quickly, a failure that's just made worse by the factional violence, the armed forces will step in. They typically justify this intervention, at least publicly, as necessary to restore order or prevent greater bloodshed.
Of course, for the good of the state.
But practically, military intervention means they're imposing their preferred leadership choice. And that immediately breaks the civilian control of the state.
And it changes everything.
It shifts the basis of legitimacy from consultation or election to just brute force. And it creates an incredibly dangerous precedent for every single transition that comes after.
That transition from political choice to the rule of the gun is, well, it's catastrophic. It fundamentally undermines the moral authority of the state.
Absolutely. Which leads to the third danger, and this one is arguably the most insidious long-term threat to the constitutional character of the state.
And that is?
Dynastic capture.
Passing it on to the family.
Yes. The powerful, outgoing leader, consciously or maybe even unconsciously, might favor their own family, a son, a brother, a close relative. If this happens, the office becomes hereditary. And this fundamentally changes the nature of governance from meritocracy and consultation, which characterized the early state, to monarchy.
Where future leadership relies on an accident of bloodline.
An accident of bloodline rather than competence or integrity or the community's consensus.
And once that door to dynasty is open, it is virtually impossible to close without some kind of revolution. It institutionalizes inequality and replaces public trust with private inheritance at the very highest level of government.
You're right. It practically guarantees the decay of the state's founding principles. And that leads to the fourth disaster.
Which is a direct result of all this.
A legitimacy crisis. If the process used to select the new leader is seen as flawed or coercive or unfair, whether it's due to factional fighting, military backing, or just the stench of dynastic maneuvering, the new leader, regardless of their personal qualifications, will fail to command universal acceptance.
So even if they're a good person, the process taints them.
Completely. A significant portion of the state, be it regional governors, specific tribes, or dissenting factions, they'll just view them as illegitimate. And that creates deep, pervasive political instability.
And that lack of universal acceptance means the new government can't actually govern, right? That inability to act effectively leads directly to the fifth and final point.
Yes, the fifth disaster, state paralysis.
Everything just stops.
Everything grinds to a halt. If the leadership transition drags on, if legitimacy is contested, governance halts. The bureaucracy stops functioning, the military sits frozen for fear of choosing the wrong side, the economy stalls. And while that's happening, regional threats or internal insurgencies can quickly metastasize into existential crises.
Wow.
And Umar understood that the state he helped build, which was expanding so rapidly across these vast territories, it couldn't afford even a few weeks of full contested uncertainty. That uncertainty is like a constitutional cancer.
So facing these five inevitable threats, violence, intervention, dynasty, a legitimacy crisis, and paralysis, he had to establish a system that explicitly and structurally negated every single one of them.
Yes.
He wasn't just planning for a candidate, he was planning for an anti-chaos mechanism. So what established models did he consciously reject? What were the easy options he decided not to take?
Well, he consciously rejected the easy historical models that would have been, very tempting in that turbulent era. The first rejected model was, as we've noted, hereditary monarchy.
The most obvious one.
The most obvious one. And while passing power by blood does provide kind of superficial short-term stability, everyone knows who the heir is, it sacrifices the meritocratic and consultative ethos of the state. It prioritizes the stability of the ruling family over the justice and competence required for governing a vast and diverse community.
And the second model he rejected was essentially the total opposite of that structured heredity. It was just the vacuum, the free-for-all.
That's the open-ended power struggle. This is the state of anarchy where might makes right.
Whoever has the biggest army wins.
Basically, the person who manages to gather the largest armed following or the most money simply takes charge. And while theoretically a very competent and powerful person might emerge victorious, the process itself is inherently chaotic, incredibly bloody, and it guarantees the immediate rise of factional violence and military intervention.
It's anarchy disguised as a selection process.
Exactly. He rejected both tyranny, which is monarchy, and chaos, which is the struggle.
So he needed a system that was structured enough to avoid chaos, but not hereditary enough to become tyranny. Consultative enough to gain legitimacy, but not so open-ended that it created paralysis.
You nailed it.
And that leads us to the fundamental constitutional principle he established, which I think is really the analytical framework for the rest of this deep dive into his foresight.
That principle is the core of his constitutional legacy. And it's a blueprint for any modern state seeking stable transitions, really. Leadership legitimacy flows from a defined, limited, consultative process.
Defined, limited, consultative.
It was imperative that the focus move entirely away from who Umar personally might have favored and onto building a robust, impartial system. A system that could produce a universally accepted outcome, regardless of personal preference or tribal power dynamics.
So the structure had to force the right outcome.
The structure itself had to do the work.
That focus on process over personality, that's what elevates this from just a simple political act, naming a successor, to a genuine act of constitutional statesmanship.
It is.
He created a constrained, high-pressure system that was literally designed to manufacture political legitimacy under emergency conditions.
The perfect summary.
Here's where it gets really, I think, structurally interesting. Rather than just naming a successor himself, which, based on the precedent set by the first caliph, Abu Bakr, he absolutely had the power to do.
Yeah.
He created a specialized institution.
And he did.
This was the 6-member electoral council, the Shūrā. This was not some symbolic advisory body, was it?
Not at all. Not the slightest. This was the ultimate constitutional body. He was granted explicit and exclusive legal empowerment to choose the next leader.
So it was a one-job committee.
Think of it as an emergency constitutional convention designed to perform one single task: succession. Umar did not leave the selection to chance or to a popular vote, which would have just invited the chaos of tribal politics.
Right.
Instead, he meticulously selected the members. He drew them from the most senior companions, people with impeccable moral standing, deep political experience, and, crucially, universal respect across the various factions of the rapidly expanding state.
And we actually have the precise list of who these constitutional architects were. We have to list them because their inclusion was a balancing act in itself.
It really was. The 6 members, all towering figures in the community, often referred to as those who were promised paradise, were Ali ibn Abi Talib,
Okay.
Uthman ibn Affan,
Right.
Abdulrahman ibn Auf, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, Al-Zubayr ibn al-Awwam, and Alawa ibn Ubaydullah.
That list is so significant. It includes Ali and Uthman, who were, let's be honest, the 2 primary most viable candidates. They represented different political and tribal centers of gravity.
It did it.
And then you have figures like Abdulrahman ibn Auf, who was a really influential sort of neutral broker who commanded immense respect.
Exactly. And by including the main potential successors within the council, Umar achieved a brilliant piece of institutional design.
What was that?
He forced the competitors to participate in the very mechanism that would bind them.
So they couldn't complain about the result later?
It preempted any possible post-selection rebellion from the losing side because they were active constitutional stakeholders in the outcome. It created shared responsibility for the decision. They owned it.
That's fascinating. Okay, let's delve into the structure itself, because Umar designed this Shūrā with what our sources call 5 structural safeguards, all aimed at preventing those specific disasters we just outlined.
Yes, 5 of them.
The first safeguard addresses size and scale. So why exactly 6 members? Why not 5 or 10 or 20?
Limited membership was a masterful political and, I'd say, psychological calculation. It was designed to counter 2 major failure modes at the same time.
Okay, what were they?
Well, if the council was too large, say 50 or 100 people, It would immediately devolve into mob politics. It would become susceptible to external lobbying, public pressure, and just lengthy, unproductive debate.
So it couldn't be a parliament.
It couldn't. That would just invite state paralysis and factional violence. But conversely, if the council were too small, say just 3 or 4 members, it would be highly vulnerable to deadlock, or even easier for a single powerful figure to just coerce or intimidate the others into submission.
So 6 is the sweet spot.
6 is that perfect constrained size. It is large enough to ensure diverse perspectives and prevent dominance by a single individual, yet it's small enough to maintain secrecy, urgency, and focused deliberation.
The goal was intense, serious, expert debate.
Insulated from the chaos of the public sphere.
Okay, so safeguard number 1 dealt with the size of the deliberative body. Safeguard number 2 dealt with the internal political dynamics, equal status.
This is fundamental, absolutely fundamental to ensuring the fairness and meritocracy of the process. Within that council, no member had formal superiority due to wealth or lineage or, their early conversion status. There was no pre-assigned chairman or tie-breaking vote based on hierarchy.
So everyone's vote was equal.
Every voice, including that of the most respected candidate, carried the exact same official weight. By treating them as constitutional equals, Umar ensured that the debate was focused purely on the merit of the candidates and their suitability for the office, not on some pre-existing hierarchy.
It successfully leveled the playing field among the most powerful men in the realm.
It did.
That structural leveling is key to preventing those legitimacy crises. But knowing the complexity of politics, even among 6 equals, debates can drag on indefinitely. Which brings us to safeguard number 3, which is, frankly, radical. The time-bound mandate. The decision was required within a maximum of 3 days.
This is perhaps the most critical constraint in preventing the disaster of state paralysis.
3 days seems impossibly short.
It's an impossibly tight deadline for such a consequential decision, yet it served multiple vital constitutional purposes. Firstly, it minimized the period of vacuum, preventing the state from drifting leaderless and vulnerable. And secondly, and this is the political genius of it, it drastically limited the time available for external influences, tribal leaders, wealthy merchants, regional governors, to travel to Medina, to lobby, to offer bribes, or to orchestrate public pressure campaigns.
He weaponized the clock against political manipulation.
That's a great way to put it, exactly. Prolonged uncertainty invites political manipulation. It allows chaos to metastasize. By forcing the decision quickly, Umar ensured the focus remained entirely internal, concentrated on the merit of the candidates and the survival of the state.
So it forced a principled outcome before political rot could set in.
The urgency was a structural defense mechanism.
That makes perfect sense. It's like an institutional pressure cooker.
Yeah.
But once that decision was forced, how did they ensure that the outcome was seen as legitimate and transparent by the wider community, especially by those outside Medina who might hear conflicting reports?
Yeah, good question.
That brings us to safeguard number 4, external neutral supervision.
And this shows a remarkable level of constitutional sophistication, especially for the 7th century. Umar appointed his own son, Abdullah ibn Umar, to be present during the deliberations as an observer.
Okay, but isn't that a conflict of interest?
Well, here is the critical check. Abdullah ibn Umar had no voting power. He was a constitutional witness, a trusted, neutral party whose role was purely to ensure the process was fair, transparent, and adhered strictly to the mandated rules set by Umar.
So he's like a constitutional referee.
Precisely. This serves as a constitutional check for transparency and accountability. It ensures that no one could later claim the process was secret or coerced or manipulated because a neutral, trusted insider had observed the entire deliberation, ready to attest to the fairness of the proceedings.
That accountability measure was essential for countering a potential legitimacy crisis.
Absolutely. And finally, the 5th safeguard addressed the very real risk of a 3-3 split, which, given the personalities involved, was a high probability scenario.
Right. What constitutional mechanism was put in place to break that structural failure within the 3-day limit? They couldn't just throw up their hands.
No, failure was not an option. Umar mandated that if unanimity failed, if they couldn't all agree on a single name, the decision of the majority would prevail.
Okay.
This was the final defense against paralysis. So if, for instance, a 4-2 vote occurred, the 4 votes constituted the binding decision.
So it guaranteed a result.
This mechanism ensured that the structural failure of indecision was constitutionally impossible within the compressed timeline. Furthermore, if the split remained 3-3, The sources indicate that they were instructed to turn to Rahman ibn Awfa,
The neutral broker.
the highly respected neutral figure, and empower him to cast the deciding vote. The process was structured to guarantee a result.
It's just fascinating how every single element was engineered to mitigate a specific political risk. The Shūrā was an institutional masterstroke. Limited in size, equal in status, urgent in mandate, transparent in operation, and structurally designed to prevent deadlock. It was a machine built to solve the succession crisis on a timer, using consultation as its engine.
That's a perfect description.
But what's truly extraordinary about this constitutional design is not just what Umar mandated inside the council. It's what he explicitly forbade outside of it.
Yes.
This speaks to an extraordinary level of constitutional self-restraint. He had to ensure the process was absolutely sterilized from the usual elements of political coercion and influence.
This is where we see the creation of a profound firewall. A firewall against factional violence and, critically, military intervention. Umar issued explicit, detailed orders designed to neutralize the political environment around the constitutional process. He mandated no military interference, no tribal pressure or mobilization, and specifically no public agitation or political campaigning in the capital while the Shūrā deliberated.
This is monumental. I mean, in virtually every modern state, the transition period is defined by intense lobbying, political rallies, public demonstrations.
Right.
And often, the military signaling its preferences through subtle or overt statements. Umar explicitly shut down all three of those avenues of external coercion.
And we have to emphasize the depth of that military prohibition. No military units were allowed near the deliberating council, except those that were strictly necessary for security.
And even those were chosen carefully.
And even those troops were carefully selected for their neutrality. The armed force was restricted solely to maintaining internal order during that 3-day window. They were neutral perimeter guard, not an influential political bloc or a selectorate.
That separation of the sword from the ballot, or in this case, the consultation, that is arguably the highest form of constitutional restraint a dying leader can enforce.
It is.
It ensured that the legitimacy of the successor was rooted in consultation, not in the proximity of force.
Precisely. And banning public agitation meant that the 6 members could focus on the merits of the candidates, free from the noise of populist demands or the risk of their decision being instantly undermined by whoever shouted the loudest outside the gates.
He protected the integrity of the deliberation from external political contamination.
He did.
But the institutional restraint aside, we have to examine the ethical neutrality of the outgoing leader himself. This is the part that, for me, truly defines the difference between a ruler who is obsessed with their personal legacy and a genuine constitutional statesman.
This demonstrates the ultimate moral constraint. Umar actively implemented 3 decisions that went against every historical precedent of powerful rulers attempting to manage their succession.
What were they?
He did not nominate his own son, he did not impose a personal preference on the Shūrā members, and he made a solemn oath not to manipulate the outcome by using his final, supreme authority to steer the debate toward a preferred candidate.
I find the exclusion of his son, Abdullah ibn Umar, particularly potent. His son was universally respected, deeply pious, and certainly politically mature.
No doubt.
It would have been the easiest, most logical dynastic move. It would have offered instant stability and protected his own lineage. So why the absolute ironclad refusal to involve his own family in the selection pool?
Because he understood that his role was to serve the constitutional state and the principles of the community, not his family's ambition.
That's a huge distinction.
He saw that by nominating his son, he would immediately violate the principle of meritocracy and, most disastrously, invite the long-term historical disaster of dynastic capture. By refusing to appoint his son as a candidate, he was symbolically and practically closing the door on monarchy for the immediate future of the nascent state. He placed the health of the institution above the status of his family.
That is a staggering act of political sacrifice. He used his final constitutional act to limit the power of his own bloodline.
It secured the Republican ethos of the community. And this ethical neutrality is beautifully captured in that quote we found in the source.
Which one is that?
If Allah wills good for this ummah, He will guide them. This wasn't passive resignation. It was supreme confidence in the constitutional process he had constructed. He was planning for the success of the state after he was gone, completely relinquishing personal control and trusting that the robust mechanism would produce the right result, regardless of which individual won.
The distinction there is so crucial. A short-sighted ruler seeks to maintain power for their lineage or their preferred successor. A constitutional statesman creates mechanisms that ensure the state survives its rulers.
Mechanisms designed to function even when the architect is removed.
Exactly.
And this commitment leads directly to the long-term constitutional objective, preventing dynastic precedent. By excluding his own family from the running, he preserved what the source terms the Republican spirit of early Islamic governance. The message resonated for decades. The highest office is a public trust, subject to a clearly defined consultative, merit-based constitutional method of selection, not a family inheritance.
And that institutionalized expectation of non-hereditary rule was perhaps the most enduring part of his foresight.
I believe so.
It set an ethical standard that future leaders, whether they followed it or not, were always measured against.
Always.
So, let's summarize the outcome. The process, compressed, intensely debated, and meticulously restrained, worked precisely as intended. After intense deliberation within that mandatory 3-day limit, the Shūrā eventually selected Uthman ibn Affan as the third caliph.
They did.
So how do we, as analysts, measure the success of this constitutional mechanism, especially given the monumental risks involved?
The sources provide a metric of success that's measured by absence. This is the crucial benchmark.
What was absent?
In that fragile moment of transition, no civil war followed. No organized rebellion erupted, and most importantly, no army intervened to influence the choice.
In a moment of supreme, almost terminal vulnerability for a vast, multi-ethnic, rapidly expanding state, the loss of its powerful, centralizing leader, the constitutional mechanism delivered immediate stability and widespread public acceptance.
It did. The process was so transparent, so limited, and so principled that even the most powerful candidate who did not win, Ali ibn Abi Talib, accepted the outcome immediately.
He was bound by the process.
He was bound by the legitimacy of the rules, even if he might have disagreed with the outcome. And that is the true definition of constitutional success, ensuring that the losers accept the process, thereby upholding the system itself.
The process superseded partisan interests.
Exactly.
This historical case provides a fascinating and, frankly, often humbling comparative insight when we look at modern constitutional crises around the world. We see states attempting similar goals, managing leadership transitions, ensuring legitimacy using tools like electoral colleges, complex constitutional amendments, or mandated caretaker governments, yet so many of them still fail catastrophically.
And they frequently fail for the very reasons Umar explicitly engineered his system to prevent. Modern transitions often suffer from vague succession rules that invite endless legal challenges.
Or executive manipulation.
Executive manipulation, where the outgoing leader attempts to cling to power or install a puppet via technicalities, or the inevitable consequence of political collapse.
Military interference.
Military interference.
It is a profound paradox. Umar achieved stability and legitimacy with a comparatively simple 6-person, 3-day mechanism. He relied primarily on high-trust actors operating under clear, constrained rules.
And it was all enforced by an ethical commitment from the highest authority to relinquish control.
Meanwhile, modern states, with thousands of pages of constitutional law and massive bureaucracies, still struggle with the same fundamental problem of power vacuums.
His solution achieved stability without bureaucracy. The complexity was in the design and the restraint, not in the regulatory volume. Clarity, urgency, neutrality, and restraint. Those were the pillars.
And that last point?
The last point, the outgoing leader voluntarily stepping back and refusing the dynastic temptation, that is the element most frequently missing in contemporary crises globally. And it's why so many transitions degenerate into civil strife.
So, for the learner today, what does this 7th century constitutional planning offer? What are the timeless, globally applicable lessons for governance, particularly relevant to states suffering from personality-driven politics or chronic constitutional ambiguity?
Well, I think there are 5 core lessons derived directly from this deep dive that are just absolutely foundational to state stability, regardless of the political system.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, succession must be formalized and planned. Ignoring the inevitable moment of transition is negligence, not neutrality. The planning must be pre-agreed and institutionalized long before the moment of crisis arrives.
And the mechanism doesn't have to be overly complex, but it has to be functional.
Precisely. Second, rules must be simple and undeniable. Ambiguity in the succession mechanism is not just a nuisance. It's an open invitation for conflict, for legal challenges, and for interpretation based on raw self-interest.
The structure has to be clear.
The structure, who decides, how they decide, and the criteria for selection. It must be simple and undeniable. Third, the process must be limited and time-bound. Prolonged uncertainty is toxic to a state and guarantees external manipulation. Imposing a tight, mandatory deadline forces resolution. It focuses the deliberators on the state's needs rather than their own protracted political maneuvering.
That structural constraint is the ultimate defense against paralysis.
It is. Fourth, armed forces must remain politically neutral. The military's role is order maintenance, not kingmaking. The constitutional statesman must draw an inviolable physical and political line between the armed forces and the political selection process.
Ensuring legitimacy flows from consultation, not coercion.
Absolutely. And fifth, and perhaps the most radical and difficult lesson of all, outgoing leaders must practice absolute restraint.
That's the hardest part.
It's the hardest part. True constitutional fidelity means relinquishing personal ambition, rejecting dynastic temptation, and trusting the institutional process you built, even if you disagree with the outcome. That step back is the final guarantor of legitimacy and stability.
5 powerful lessons.
This entire deep dive has been an exploration of one powerful concept: constitutional foresight. It's the profound ability to look past the immediate demands of personal power and to structure the environment for the state's long-term institutional survival.
That's a great way to put it.
Hazrat Umar ibn al-Khattab, may God be pleased with him, designed a comprehensive, constrained framework for a future in which he would no longer exist. He protected the stability of the community, not through the sheer strength of his own personality or army, but through the strength of the system he put in place, a system that could bind the most powerful men in the land to a single legitimate outcome.
So this historical case is not just an anecdote.
Not at all. It is a masterclass in governance structure and ethical restraint. The powerful closing statement from our source material summarizes his genius perfectly. True statesmanship is not about ruling forever. It is about ensuring stability after you are gone.
And that stability, achieved through clarity, urgency, and radical restraint, remains the gold standard for navigating the most dangerous moment of any state's existence. But the Shūrā we discussed today was an emergency response.
Right, it was a plan for a sudden vacuum following an assassination.
It was an ad hoc constitutional convention. And that leaves us with a highly provocative thought for you to mull over. If the emergency succession framework was handled with such meticulous institutional detail and foresight, what framework existed for day-to-day governance? How did Umar institutionalize consultation and collective wisdom when the state wasn't facing an existential crisis?
That's the natural next question, isn't it?
It is, and that is precisely what we will explore in our next deep dive. We'll shift from emergency response to institutional continuity, examining the established permanent framework for institutionalized consultation, the Consultative Council or the Majlis al-Shūrā governance through collective wisdom. We hope you'll join us for that essential follow-up on how early governance functioned day to day. Until then, stay informed.